Fine. Let's start. Number 12. The Village Under the Rocket. 3 in the morning, February 15th, 1996. Xichang, in the mountains of Sichuan province. China is about to fly the first Long March 3B, and sitting on top of it is an American communications satellite called Intelsat 708, worth more money than most of the people watching that night will earn in their lifetimes. The rocket lights. It rises maybe a few meters, and then it leans. Not a wobble. A lean. 426 tons of vehicle, still almost completely full of propellant, pitching over before it has even cleared the umbilical tower and heading down the valley almost horizontally. Engines still burning at full power. It flies like that for 22 seconds. Then it hits a hillside about 1,850 meters from the pad, next to the launch center's main gate. There was a village there. There were houses on that hillside. An American engineer working in the satellite processing building that night kept a diary. He wrote that a tremendous light turned 3 in the morning into noon, that every tree on the hillside was as clear as a knife edge, that the sky reflected a color he could not describe. And then he heard the biggest explosion of his life, and he turned, and he started to run. Now here is where this becomes a different kind of story. 2 weeks later, the state news agency issued a statement. 6 dead, 57 injured, more than 80 local houses damaged. And that was it. That was the account. That is still the account. Western observers who were on the ground that night did not believe it. Neither did a lot of people who saw the footage, because footage exists. Somebody smuggled a tape out, and Israeli television broadcast it a month later. The cameraman has never been identified. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a lot of videos go off a cliff. You will hear numbers in the hundreds. Those numbers are not established. There is a serious, careful reconstruction by the space historian Chen Lan arguing the opposite, that villages within 2.5 kilometers had been evacuated as standard practice since the mid-1980s, that the village's population kept growing afterwards, and that in the better part of 2 decades of a famously unruly Chinese internet, not one credible first-hand account of mass local death ever surfaced. His conclusion is that heavy casualties can almost certainly be ruled out. So I am not going to tell you hundreds of people died. I do not know that. Nobody watching this knows that. But here is what is not in dispute. There was no casualty list. There was no memorial. The 2 engineers who died, Chen Jing and Yang Linzhen, were not publicly named for 16 years. 16. Their names finally surfaced in a company commemorative address in 2012. And when that American safety specialist, a man named Bruce Campbell, came back to Xichang years later to watch launches that actually worked, he looked for the village outside the gate. It was gone, not rebuilt, not relocated with a plaque. Gone, with nothing to say it had ever been there. The truth about that night may well be the boring truth. 6 people. A bad bonding point in a servo loop. It may be exactly what they said, but the way you would build a record that nobody can ever check looks precisely like this. And for one hillside in Sichuan, that is the record we have. Number 11. The men blamed for 16 years. Plesetsk Cosmodrome, 800 kilometers north of Moscow. March 18th, 1980. 7 in the evening. There is a Vostok 2M on the pad, being fueled for a launch that is still a couple of hours away, and there are about 141 men working on and around it. The rocket explodes during fueling. More than 200 tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen go up at once. 44 men die where they stand. 43 go to hospital with burns. 4 of those die too. 48 in total, in a few seconds, in the snow. The State Commission convenes. It is chaired by a deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, and it returns a finding, and the finding is this. The explosion was caused by the inflammation of material soaked in liquid oxygen, as a result of unauthorized actions by one of the members of the ground crew. Read that again slowly. Unauthorized actions by one of the members of the ground crew, every one of whom is dead. The version that circulated was that somebody had wrapped cloth around a leaking oxygen hose. You will also hear that somebody was smoking. That one is folklore, but it stuck, and it did the same work. It made 48 dead men responsible for their own deaths, and it made the hardware innocent. 16 years later, that finding was overturned. Here's what actually happened. The third stage used hydrogen peroxide, and hydrogen peroxide runs through filters. Those filters were manufactured at a plant in Sumi, and at some point before 1980, somebody at that plant changed the solder. Instead of pure tin, they used a tin-lead alloy because it made a difficult, capricious manufacturing step easier. Lead is a catalyst for hydrogen peroxide. Put lead in contact with concentrated peroxide, and the peroxide starts tearing itself apart, and that reaction produces heat, and that heat melts more solder into the tank, and now you have a runaway. In July of 1981, almost the exact same thing nearly happened again, and that near miss is what finally pointed investigators at the filters. The combat crew was formally rehabilitated on the 5th of February, 1996. It took an interdepartmental commission, and, in the words of the man who ran Plesetsk through the late 80s, the Herculean efforts of the Cosmodrome's veterans. So, 48 men were killed by a purchasing decision made in a factory hundreds of kilometers away. And then, officially, for 16 years, they were the ones who did it. The Soviet public was not told any of this at the time. The disaster was not mentioned in Soviet media at all until September of 1989, 9.5 years later, when foreign journalists were allowed into Plesetsk for the first time, walked into the main square of the nearby town, and found themselves looking at a memorial to something they had never heard of. They asked, and a spokesman confirmed it, and on the same visit, almost in passing, they learned about another fueling explosion at the same Cosmodrome in 1973 that had killed 9 more. 2 disasters, 57 dead, discovered by accident by reporters reading a monument in a town square. Number 10. 21. Engineers on a Friday afternoon. Brazil does not usually come up in these lists, and that is part of the point. Alcântara Launch Center on the northern coast. August 22, 2003. 1:30 in the afternoon. Brazil's own satellite launcher, the VLS-1, is standing inside a 10-story mobile service tower, 3 days out from launch. It is about 30 meters tall, 50 tons, carrying 40 tons of solid propellant, and 2 small satellites. Technicians are working on it. The detonators were installed that morning at 11:30. One of the 4 strap-on boosters ignites. Not a leak, not a fire that spreads. A solid rocket booster lighting up inside an enclosed steel tower with people standing next to it. Solid propellant does not have an off switch. Once it goes until it is finished, and it took the rest of the vehicle with it. 21 people were killed. The tower was destroyed. The investigation ran for months and produced a 130-page report. It concluded that the igniter had fired because of stray electrical energy in the firing line, most probably an electrostatic discharge, either a sudden pulse of about 1.2 amps or a weaker current sustained for around 5 minutes. They measured electrostatic potentials in the detonator wiring reaching about 3,000 volts. That is the cause, and it is also not a cause because they could never say where the energy came from. Nobody has ever identified the source. 21 people died of an electrical event that the investigation could describe in detail and could not locate. And the report said something else, quieter, that got much less attention than the electrical mystery. It found an inoperable weather radar, degraded safety procedures, thin training, poor quality management. Brazil's entire space program had consumed about $300 million over 42 years. That is not a serious budget for building rockets. That is a rounding error. And its budget that year, was smaller still. The investigation, incidentally, was run from inside the same organization that built and operated the vehicle. But the thing that makes Alcantara sit differently from the other entries on this list is what was actually lost. 11 of the 21 dead were university-trained aerospace engineers, not junior staff, senior people, mostly from the same technical center at San Jose dos Campos, in a discipline where the countries that have it deliberately do not hand it to the countries that do not. You cannot rehire that. There is no market to rehire it from. Brazil lost, in one afternoon, most of the people who knew how to build a launch vehicle, and no amount of money afterwards could conjure them back. The VLS never flew again. The program was formally canceled in 2016, 13 years later, still dying of an explosion on a Friday afternoon. One of the scientists at Brazil's Space Research Institute put it plainly at the time. With this level of investment, he said, we are not going to realize the dream of having autonomy in space that our colleagues died for. Number 9. The mission that was announced as a success. November 1968. The Soviet Union launches Zond 6, an uncrewed prototype of the spacecraft they intend to send cosmonauts around the moon in. Aboard are turtles, flies, bacteria, a small biological payload, along with cameras. It launches on the 10th. On the 14th, it swings around the far side of the moon at a distance of about 2,400 kilometers and takes photographs. Real photographs. The moon from close up on film. The state news agency announces a success. Here is the mission that actually occurred. 2 days after the lunar flyby, on the 16th, cabin pressure started falling. A hatch seal was leaking. Over about 7 minutes, the pressure dropped noticeably, then stabilized at roughly half of what it should be, and then kept going. By the time the descent module separated, it was down to a fraction of normal, and then it fell to effectively nothing. Vacuum. The animals died slowly over roughly a day of decompression on the way home. Then re-entry. The parachute deployed correctly at 7.5 kilometers. And then the electronics, sitting in an unpressurized compartment they were never designed to operate in, produced a corona discharge, and the altimeter issued a command it should never have issued. And at 5,300 meters, the parachute lines were cut, and the soft landing engines fired into open air. The capsule fell the rest of the way to the Kazakh steppe. Now, the sequence I just described is not disputed by anybody. It comes from the Deputy Designer General's own report to the State Commission that December, and from the diaries and memoirs of the people running the program. Here is the part I keep turning over. The success announcement went out before anyone had found the spacecraft. On the 18th, 50 fixed-wing aircraft and 20 helicopters searched for it and found nothing at all. The entire basis for declaring the mission a triumph was radar data putting the capsule somewhere inside a circle about 500 kilometers across. They announced victory over a spacecraft they could not locate. The parachute was spotted the next morning, 38 kilometers northeast of a town called Novokazalinsk, with nothing attached to it. The capsule was found about 3 kilometers away, around midday, crushed into the ground, protruding barely a meter, and it still had its self-destruct charge aboard. 10 kilograms of explosive, armed, that had failed to fire. Before anyone could get the film out, 2 men had to walk up to a wrecked spacecraft and disarm a live bomb by hand, using non-striking tools. They got the film. It was deformed, partly torn, partly overexposed, and some of those frames were published. Real photographs of the moon, offered to the world as evidence of a successful mission. That is the thing about Zond 6 that I find genuinely difficult. The pictures were not fake. Nothing about the pictures was a lie. They were taken by a real spacecraft that really flew around the real moon. They were just evidence for a mission that had already killed everything aboard it, and then destroyed itself on impact. Number 8. The commander who paid for it. June 25th, 1997. The space station Mir, 11 years into a design life of 5. The Russian space program is broke. The automated docking system they have always used, called Kurs, is built in Ukraine, and after Ukrainian independence, the price has gone up by something like 400%. Cargo flights have been cut from 6 a year to 3, so Mission Control decides to test whether they can dock a cargo ship manually instead, using a remote control system called Toru, and stop paying for Kurs altogether. The commander, Vasily Tsibliev, is going to fly a 7-ton uncrewed freighter into a space station by hand. To clear up video interference, the ranging telemetry is switched off, so he has no distance readout, no closing speed readout. He is flying an object he cannot see toward a station he is standing inside, using a black and white video feed, and he will not get a good look at it until it is seconds away. He does his braking burn. 53 seconds. It is not enough. He fires again, another 52 seconds. Also not enough. Progress comes in at about 3 meters per second, clips a solar array, and punches into the Spectre module. The station starts venting. This is the first depressurization of a crewed spacecraft in orbit, ever. Alexander Lasutkin and the NASA astronaut Michael Foale get the hatch to Spectre closed by cutting through the cables running through it with a knife, and those cables were carrying the power from Spectre's solar arrays. Cutting them saved the station and cost roughly 60% of its electricity. Mir was left tumbling in the dark. Foale worked out the rotation rate by holding his thumb up against the stars. It took about 30 hours to get power back. In September, a Russian commission concluded, and I am quoting the reporting here, beyond any doubt that Tsibliev and Lasutkin were responsible. The Russian coordinator of the Mir NASA program said they would likely be fined. For a test they were ordered to fly. Because here is what came out afterwards. Sergei Krikalev, one of the most respected cosmonauts alive, had objected to the test before it happened and been overruled. His words, "I was against it, but I was not heard." Many specialists were against the test, but they would not speak out. The freighter had been loaded wrong on the ground, shifting its center of mass so it did not handle the way the profile assumed. Tsibliev was exhausted and had not practiced a docking in more than 4 months, and he could not have refused. His flight bonus, his actual pay, was contingent on following Mission Control's instructions. There is an account, and I want to flag that it comes through secondary sources rather than a published Russian test report, that 5 of the best pilots at Star City later flew the same approach in the simulator using the exact maneuvers Tsibliev had been given. All 5 of them hit Spectre in the same place. The independent Stafford Commission looked at all of it and concluded the crew had done everything they could. NASA's own case study treats it as a system failure, not a crew failure. None of which changed the finding that went out first, and none of which is what most people remember. Tsibliev landed in August and talked to reporters within hours. "It's easy to find a scapegoat," he said, "but tomorrow a similar problem may happen with another cargo ship." Number 7. 21 Gs over Siberia. April 5th, 1975. Vasily Lazarev and Oleg Makarov launch from Tyuratam heading for the Salyut 4 station. 295 seconds into the flight, something in the staging goes wrong. 3 of the 6 latches holding the third stage's aft skirt release early, before the second stage has separated. The remaining 3 are torn apart by the loads. The stages come apart violently. The vehicle starts rolling at about 20 degrees per second. It goes past its attitude limits, and the abort system does exactly what it was built to do. The descent module separates and keeps going up. It reaches 192 kilometers. And then it comes back down. Not on a controlled entry. A tumbling capsule does not generate lift. It generates the opposite. It gets pushed down harder, and the deceleration profile turns into a wall. 21.3 G. The design limit for that vehicle was 15. At 21 G, your body weighs 21 times what it should. You cannot lift your hand. You cannot inflate your chest against it. The two men tried to scream, because screaming relieves some of the pressure on the chest, and Makarov described what came out. Our screams, he said, were resembling groaning. They lost vision. They were close to losing consciousness. The whole flight, launch to landing, lasted 21 minutes and 27 seconds. They came down 1,574 kilometers downrange in the Altai Mountains, in deep snow at about 1,200 meters of elevation, roughly 320 kilometers from the Chinese border, which, in 1975, with Sino-Soviet relations where they were, was its own quiet emergency. The capsule slid and stopped, and it stopped at the edge of a drop into a canyon. What held it was the parachute, tangled in trees. Rescue helicopters found them, but could not reach them safely in the dark, and Lazarev himself told them to call it off until morning rather than risk anyone. So the two of them spent the night on a mountainside in Siberia in April, burning pieces of shed, heat shielding for warmth, inside a capsule held over a canyon by a parachute in a tree. The next morning, a rescue party climbed up to them and set off an avalanche and got buried and had to be dug out. Everyone survived. Now, the Soviets did announce this one within about a day, which is unusual, but look at what the announcement said. It said the crew had landed in good health near a particular town. It did not mention 21G. It did not mention the canyon. It did not mention the avalanche. And the flight was never assigned an official Soyuz number, which is why, to this day, the record calls it Soyuz 18A, or Soyuz 18-1, depending on who wrote the book you are reading. And the reason they said anything at all may be the least romantic part of the story. The joint Apollo-Soyuz mission with the Americans was 3 months away. American officials were in constant contact with their Soviet counterparts. A suborbital ballistic flight leaves no orbital track. No foreign radar would ever have seen it, and it could have been buried completely. But a rumor surfacing later about the same family of launch vehicle the Americans were about to fly alongside could have wrecked the whole thing. So they told the truth. A carefully shaped, load-bearing, 20% version of the truth. Not because it was true, but because it was the cheapest option available. Number 6. Operation Morning Light. The Soviet Union flew a series of radar reconnaissance satellites designed to track NATO ships. Radar needs a lot of power, and in the 1970s, in low orbit, that meant one thing. They put nuclear reactors in them. The design assumed that at end of life, the reactor core would be boosted up to a high disposal orbit where it could sit out its radioactivity for centuries. That was the plan. That was the safety case. On the 24th of January, 1978, Cosmos 954 failed to perform that boost and came down over northern Canada instead. It broke up during re-entry and laid a trail of radioactive debris across the Northwest Territories, running roughly 600 kilometers. The contaminated area worked out to something like 124,000 square kilometers. That is a piece of ground larger than a lot of countries. Canada and the United States launched a joint recovery called Operation Morning Light. They set up a temporary base near the Thalin River. Teams walked the barren lands on foot in an Arctic winter with handheld detectors and flew survey patterns overhead for 84 days of searching and then cleanup running into October. They recovered about 66 kilograms of radioactive debris. Some of it was genuinely dangerous. Fragments that would have given you a serious dose if you had picked one up and put it in your pocket. And a few pieces were found by people who very nearly did. But most of what came down was not fragments. Most of it was particles the size of grains of pepper, spread across a landscape the size of a small nation, completely invisible without an instrument. Here is the number that reframes the whole thing. Canada's own nuclear regulator estimated afterwards that Operation Morning Light recovered about 0.1% of the satellite's power source. 0.1%, which means 99.9% of a nuclear reactor is still out there, in the tundra, dispersed into dust and scattered over an area you could lose most of a European country in. I want to be fair about what that does and does not mean, because that figure gets swung around irresponsibly. It does not mean there is a hot zone. Diluted across that much emptiness, most of it is a genuinely minor hazard, and no radiation injuries were ever documented from Cosmos 954. The dose you would receive standing on that ground today is not the story. The story is what happened next. Canada spent something close to $14 million on the recovery. It then submitted a formal claim to the Soviet Union for only about $6 million, just the costs it could document as directly attributable. The two sides negotiated across 3 rounds through 1980. And in April of 1981, they signed a settlement in Moscow for $3 million, in full and final settlement, with no admission of legal liability, under a quarter of what it cost, explicitly conceding nothing. That is the only claim ever brought under the international treaty governing liability for objects falling out of space. The one time the system was actually used, it ended in a negotiated payment that established no principle, assigned no fault, and set no precedent for the next one. And there was one more group nobody was counting. The Dean communities who live on that land were not meaningfully consulted, and Canada's claim included nothing on their behalf. The people whose ground it actually was were, in the accounting, not a party to any of it. Number 5. The billion-dollar fireball with no name. Cape Canaveral, 7:30 in the morning, August the 12th, 1998. A Titan IV lifts off carrying a payload for the National Reconnaissance Office. What that payload was has never been officially stated. It has still never been officially stated. 39.4 seconds into flight, as the rocket passes through the region of maximum vibration, a damaged wire somewhere in the vehicle's power supply starts shorting out. The guidance computer browns out. Its input voltage falls below the threshold it needs, down to about 18.8 volts against a floor of 21.8, and it loses its timing reference to the inertial platform. Then the power comes back, and the computer wakes up believing the rocket has pitched 26 degrees away from where it should be. It had not. But the computer thought so, and the computer's job is to correct errors, so it corrected an error that did not exist. It commanded a hard pitch down and yaw right. The rocket obeyed. It went past its structural angle of attack at maximum aerodynamic pressure, and one of the solid rocket motors tore loose. 41.5 seconds after liftoff, it was over. Range safety sent the destruct command 4 seconds after that. The whole thing happened at 17,000 feet, about 4,400 feet downrange. Telemetry later showed at least 30 separate electrical shorts, each lasting between 1 and 20 milliseconds. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because that vehicle had 44 documented wiring defects with shorting potential, the highest defect count of any Titan IV-A ever built. It had also sat in storage in Colorado for more than 5 years, from 1992 to 1997, before being brought out and flown. But the accident board could not close the loop. They could not find the wire. Only 30 to 40% of the booster was recovered from the seabed. Of 22 critical components on their list, they found 11, and every one of the 11 was undamaged. The cause was reconstructed entirely from telemetry, circuit simulation, and shake table testing, and the tests only reproduced the failure signature when engineers deliberately injected at least 3 5-millisecond shorts, 50 milliseconds apart. The board president wrote it out plainly in the statement of opinion. "We cannot state with clear and convincing evidence," he wrote, "that the mishap was the result of poor workmanship, handling, transportation, or simple carelessness in the entry or exit of a compartment." That is an unusually honest thing for an accident report to say. They published a detailed public account that admits, at its center, that they do not know what damaged the wire, or where the wire was, or whether it was one wire or several. The launch vehicle and launch cost about $344 million. With the payload, the reported total loss runs somewhere between 1.3 and 1.44 billion, depending on what you count. And what fell into the Atlantic that morning has never been named. The best public guess comes from an outside analyst at the Federation of American Scientists, who identified it as an advanced signals intelligence satellite designed to unfurl an antenna over 300 feet across. That is inference. It has never been confirmed. $1.5 billion of something went into the sea off Florida in front of everybody, and the object's name is still classified. Not the cause, not the failure. The name. Number 4. 3 days out and gone. August 21st, 1993. Mars Observer is 3 days from Mars. This is NASA's return to Mars after 17 years. Nothing American has gone there since the Vikings. The spacecraft has crossed 450 million miles over 11 months, and it is about to fire its engine and drop into orbit around another planet. Before that burn, it has to pressurize its propellant tanks. And there is a wrinkle in the sequence. Transmitting during pressurization risks damaging the traveling wave tube amplifiers in the radio. So the stored command sequence turns the transmitter off. The spacecraft goes quiet, exactly as designed. It never comes back. No signal, no carrier, nothing, then or ever. The most expensive thing anybody had sent to Mars simply stopped existing as far as Earth was concerned, 3 days out. The investigation board, chaired by Timothy Coffey, did everything you can do. And what they produced was not a cause. It was a most probable cause, which is a very specific phrase that means we think it was this and we cannot prove it. Their leading candidate, a rupture in the fuel pressurization line. The chain runs like this. The propulsion system used monomethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, which ignite on contact with each other. That is the whole point of them. Check valves were supposed to keep them apart, and those valves were rated for about 5 days of operation near Earth. They got 11 months and 450 million miles, and the temperatures near Mars are a great deal colder than the ones they were qualified against. Managers had decided, back in February of 1992, to delay pressurizing the tanks until the spacecraft was near Mars. A decision made for good reasons, based on other spacecraft having had trouble with early pressurization. But it meant those valves sat holding back an oxidizer for the entire cruise. The board's picture is that nitrogen tetroxide leaked past over those months, met the fuel side, and when pressurization began, the line ruptured. Helium and liquid fuel vented out from under the thermal blanket, asymmetrically, like a badly aimed thruster. That spun the spacecraft up. The spin threw it into contingency mode. Contingency mode interrupted the stored command sequence, the same sequence that was going to turn the transmitter back on. And so the radio stayed off on a spacecraft that was probably still alive, tumbling 450 million miles away, waiting for an instruction that had already been canceled. Maybe. That is the honest word. The board also listed 3 other possibilities they could not rule out. A short circuit in the regulated power bus, an overpressurization of the oxidizer tank from a regulator failure, or a pyro valve firing an initiator at high speed into the fuel tank. 4 candidate ways to die. No way to choose between them. Forever. I want to be straight with you about this one, because it does not belong in the same category as some of the others on this list. Nobody hid anything here. The report was public, and it was candid, and NASA did not lie to anyone about Mars Observer. This is not secrecy. This is the other thing. This is the limit of what can be known. The failure happened during the one window in the entire mission when the spacecraft had been deliberately built not to talk. Engineers designed a moment of silence to protect a component, and the spacecraft used that moment to die and took the only evidence with it. There is no wreckage to examine. There is no black box. It is somewhere out there right now, a 2.5-ton machine with a dish antenna, going around the sun on whatever trajectory the accident left it on, carrying the answer, not talking. Number 3, the shuttle that almost died 15 years early. December 2nd, 1988. Atlantis launches on STS-27. It is only the second shuttle flight since Challenger, and it is a classified Department of Defense mission, which matters more than it sounds like it should. 85 seconds into ascent, a piece of ablative material comes off the nose cone of the right solid rocket booster and hits the orbiter. The crew, Commander Robert Gibson, known as Hoot, with Guy Gardner, Mike Mullane, Jerry Ross, and Bill Shepard, get to orbit, and then they do what you would do. They put the robot arms camera on the underside of the vehicle, and they look. And what they see frightens them badly. The heat shield is chewed up. There is a bright spot where a tile appears to be missing entirely. So they downlink the imagery to mission control. And here is the classified part biting. Because this is a DoD mission, the video cannot go down on the normal channel. It goes through an encrypted link, and it comes out the other end degraded, grainier, lower contrast, less resolution than the crew is looking at on orbit. Mission Control looks at the degraded imagery and comes back and says it looks like lighting and shadow effects. Gibson's reaction, by his own account, was not diplomatic. He believed the vehicle was going to burn up on re-entry, that he and his crew were going to die. And this is the part that stays with me. He decided that if it happened, he wanted to be looking at his instruments when it did. He did not want it to be a surprise. He wanted to know it was coming for the last 30 seconds. That is what he flew re-entry thinking about. They landed. And when the ground crews walked up to Atlantis, the assessment was, roughly, the worst damage anybody had ever seen come back on an orbiter. 707 impacts. And one tile was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Down to the structure. Now. The reason 5 people walked away from that runway instead of coming apart over the Pacific is almost stupid in how arbitrary it is. The missing tile happened to be located directly over the steel mounting plate for the L-band antenna. That plate is not thermal protection. It is a piece of structure that happens to be a thick slab of steel in a place where the rest of the vehicle is aluminium. Aluminium at re-entry temperatures does not stay a structure for very long. Steel bought them the seconds they needed. The plate took the heating, deformed, and held. A random piece of antenna hardware is the reason that Mission is a story about a scare instead of a story about a memorial. And now the part that makes this belong on this list. Everything I have just told you was known in December of 1988. Documented, photographed, filed. That debris shed during ascent can strike the orbiter, that it can take out thermal protection, and that this can very nearly kill a crew. All of it was established fact, sitting in a record 15 years before the 1st of February 2003, when Columbia came apart over Texas because debris shed during ascent had struck the orbiter and taken out thermal protection. I am not going to tell you NASA covered up STS-27 because that is not true and it does not need to be. The damage was documented and repaired and eventually discussed openly. The truthful version is worse and quieter than a cover-up. The classification degraded the imagery. Mission Control dismissed the crew in real time. The incident got processed as an anomaly that had been survived rather than a warning that had been received. And the institution went on to treat foam strikes as a maintenance issue for 15 more years. The information was never hidden. It just never traveled. Number 2. The hole in the wall nobody will explain. Overnight, on the 29th of August, 2018, flight controllers watching the International Space Station noticed the pressure dropping. It is slow. It is not an emergency. But air is going somewhere, and on a spacecraft, air going somewhere is the only thing that really matters. The crew wakes up and starts hunting for it, module by module. They find it in the orbital module of the Soyuz MS-09, the spacecraft docked to the station, the vehicle that is supposed to take 3 people home. It is a hole about 2 millimeters across, and when they get a good look at it, it is immediately, obviously wrong. It is not a micrometeorite strike. A micrometeorite hits from outside at kilometers per second and leaves a crater with a specific signature. This is a clean bore. It was drilled. That was officially confirmed within days. And around it, in the metal, there are gouges, scratch marks, multiple places where a drill bit skated across the surface before it finally bit and went through. Whoever made that hole was not steady, and they tried more than once. And then somebody covered it. There was a patch over it, described later as a low-quality patch job, of a kind that would hold on the ground and would not hold in vacuum. It held long enough to get through inspection, through launch, and through several weeks in orbit before it let go. So, somebody drilled through the pressure hull of a crewed spacecraft, badly, and then hid it rather than reporting it. The crew sealed it with epoxy and gauze, which sounds improvised because it was, and it worked. In December, Russian cosmonauts went outside and cut through the external insulation to look at the other side of it, which is not a thing anybody had ever done to an operational Soyuz before. Roscosmos convened a commission. That commission concluded by October that it was not a materials or manufacturing defect in the ordinary sense. Then, in September of 2019, the head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozin, said publicly that the agency knew exactly what had happened and that it would not be telling anyone. The results were handed to law enforcement. They have never been published. Not in 2019, not since. NASA asked. The answer was no. I want to be careful about the temptation here, because this is the item where the internet loses its mind. During 2018, there were public suggestions from the Russian side about deliberate sabotage in orbit, and there has never been a shred of evidence made public for that. And the boring explanation covers everything we can actually see. A worker on the ground makes a mistake on a component. The bit slips a few times. It goes through. Admitting it means consequences, so they patch it, and say nothing, and hope. That is a human being having the worst day of their working life, not a conspiracy. But look at what is actually established, stripped of speculation. An agency investigated a breach of a crewed spacecraft's hull. It announced publicly that it had determined the answer, and then it classified the answer and gave it to the police. And 8 years later, the rest of us still do not have it. That is not a mystery that defeated anybody. Nobody ran out of evidence. Nobody hit the limit of what could be known, the way they did with Mars Observer. Somebody knows. Somebody has known the whole time. And every other item on this list is a thing we cannot find out. This one is a thing we are not being told. Number 1. The rocket that officially never existed. The 3rd of July, 1969. 13 days before Apollo 11 leaves Florida. At Baikonur, at 18 minutes past 11 at night, the Soviet Union launches the second N-1. This is their moon rocket. The vehicle meant to put a Soviet cosmonaut on the lunar surface, standing on a pad in the dark with 30 engines lit underneath its first stage. 30 engines. That is the number to hold on to. The Americans went with 5 very large engines on the Saturn V. The Soviets did not have an engine that big, so they clustered 30 smaller ones and built a control system to keep them balanced. And every single one of those 30 is a chance for something to go wrong. Something went wrong almost immediately. The reconstruction points at engine number 8, a liquid oxygen turbopump failing within moments of ignition, possibly because debris got into it. The rocket climbed about 200 meters. Then it leaned and stopped climbing and came back down onto the launch complex it had left a few seconds earlier. What happened next is the largest explosion in the history of rocketry and one of the largest non-nuclear explosions human beings have ever produced by any means. The commonly cited figure is around 7 kilotons of TNT equivalent, and I will say plainly that that is an estimate, and estimates vary, and nobody was standing there with instruments. But the pad was destroyed. Windows broke kilometers away. Debris was thrown across the steppe. The complex took years to rebuild. Nobody died. The pad had been cleared. And now, the actual story. The Soviet Union did not acknowledge that any of it had happened. Not the explosion. Not the rocket. Not the program. Not the race. For roughly 2 decades, the official position was that the Soviet Union had never been competing to land a man on the moon. It had never intended to. The Americans had been running against themselves. There was no N1, because there had been no lunar program, because there had been nothing to lose. That position held until the Glasnost era, around 1989. 20 years. Now think about what 20 years of that does. The space race is one of the most documented episodes of the 20th century. It is taught in schools. There are libraries about it. And for 2 decades, the histories were written with a hole in them exactly the shape of the losing side, because the losing side would not confirm it had ever been on the field. American reconnaissance could see a wrecked launch complex. Analysts knew something enormous was being built. But knowing and being able to say are different things, and a rival you cannot document is a rival who, in the record, is not there. So the version of Apollo most people carry around, the triumph, the finish line, the flag, took its shape partly from an absence. Not from a lie anybody told about Apollo. From a silence somebody else maintained about themselves. And that is the thing I keep coming back to, at the end of a list like this one. Every item here is a place where the record and the event came apart. A village with no casualty list. 48 men convicted of their own deaths by a commission. A triumphant announcement issued over a smashed capsule nobody had found yet. A commander fined for a test he was ordered to fly. A satellite that fell on a country and settled for pennies. $1 billion of something with no name. A spacecraft that died in the 1 minute it was built not to speak. A warning that sat in a file for 15 years and never traveled. A hole in a hull that somebody, right now, today, could explain and will not. And a rocket the size of a building that blew up in front of the world and officially did not exist. We tend to assume the record is the thing that survives, that the facts are what is left when the people are gone. But the record is made by people too, and it is made under pressure and by institutions that have to answer for themselves, and on deadlines, and in the dark. None of these were secrets forever. Almost all of them came out, after 16 years, after 20, after a memorial in a town square was spotted by a journalist who happened to be looking, which raises the only question worth ending on, not what is being hidden. That is the easy question, and it is usually the wrong one. The real question is, how many of the things we are currently certain about are simply the parts that have not been corrected yet? Thank you for watching and sticking till the end. We've got plenty more videos coming in the future. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss them. See you in the next one. You in